Good morning. Good morning. Today we are talking about carbohydrates in food. Before we get into it, I'm probably going to drop a few questions on the Creator article discussing creatine. So be prepared for those next. All right. Carbohydrates. If you look at the syllabus, I decided to flip this week and decided to go with carbohydrates first, mostly because I find personally carbohydrates are more interesting than fat, personally. Um, I think if you take away anything, and I don't really discuss it much going forward, but if you take away anything, if you look at any diet where people are attempting to lose weight and decrease their mass, the most common theme between every diet is some type of manipulation in carbohydrate ingestion, where mostly protein intake remains relatively the same or in fact actually increases during dietary protocols. Carbohydrate manipulation usually decreases for most diets, whether you're looking at like a paleo, a keto, or whatever it is, an Atkins diet, something along those lines. A lot of them involve carbohydrate manipulation, right? So here's the overview. Let's kind of get right into it. Today's a lot. I apologize. It'll probably be more than the standard 30-35 minutes, but I think it's important for you guys to understand a lot of these underpinnings first, and then you guys can see how I sometimes use some of these, whether it's molecular or physiological underpinnings, for some of my recommendations. So at the very basic level, carbohydrate, what is it? It's compound composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So that's why you'll see that abbreviation of CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And I use that pretty much all the time these days. So carbohydrates exist in various forms based on their chemical composition. At the most simplest level, we have monosaccharides. Of the monosaccharides, what's most relevant for us as human beings and our metabolism? That's glucose. Glucose is incredibly important, as you guys will see in later slides. But other monosaccharides include fructose and galactose. I specifically put fruits and vegetables in here because we don't really ingest glucose purely that often, although you can, and you don't find galactose in food by itself. Galactose is broken down from disaccharides. So our disaccharides, we have several, and they can be composed of two monosaccharides, right? So sucrose is composed of glucose and fructose. Lactose is composed of glucose plus galactose, and then maltose is two glucose molecules. And then finally, where a lot of our carbohydrate calories take place are really as polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are really composed of glucose only, and these are your starches, fibers, and glycogen. Starches are really in grains, legumes, potatoes, all of those things. So before we go on, I'd like to pull something from some other classes where we talk about fiber a little bit, or what is fiber, right? So what are the benefits of fiber? First and foremost, increased satiety. If somebody is looking to lose weight, you want to feel fuller, right? Having a decent amount of fiber in your diet is important. This just corresponds to a decreased food intake. It can also help maintain your blood sugar levels, improve gastrointestinal health, prevent constipation. So fiber is very important. You find these in whole grains, fruits and vegetables, beans and nuts. Now, I think the more interesting thing is, well, what is fiber, right? So here's a cool picture of fiber, right? Fiber is essentially like a grass kernel, a seed almost. And this is what it looks like up close, where there's three components of fiber: the bran, the endosperm, and the germ. Now, you'll see foods that are either whole wheat or not whole wheat. So if it's whole wheat, they are less refined and they don't strip products, right? So what happens is when whole wheat is processed, typically we're removing the bran and the germ, right? So if you look at this cool little table right here, it tells you what's the macronutrient breakdown of all of these components, right? So I believe this is percentages, not grams, but I could be wrong. So you guys can see, right, in terms of fiber, right, the bran and the germ contain the vast majority of the fiber, right? So if you're eating white bread, it has mostly been stripped of its fiber because it's removed the bran and the germ. Additionally, and this is why we want to eat whole wheats, whole foods in certain situations, you could see that the vitamins and minerals are also mostly found in the bran and the germ. So again, white bread is largely empty. White bread, which is going to be consistent mostly of the endosperm, it's going to be mostly carbohydrates. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not a terrible thing. It really depends on the situation. But if your goal is to have more fiber, you definitely should be eating whole wheat bread, whole grain pastas. If your goal is to have more vitamins and minerals, you should definitely be eating more whole bread, whole grains. All right? So this slide really should come in bullet pointed almost and like appear. So it says highly processed foods are basically foods with added sugars for flavor, right? Highly processed foods equal bad. I kind of just wrote that. Well, you'll see. Why are they considered bad? Generally speaking, they're not as satiating. So as you guys just saw, right? If that fiber is removed, right? It's not going to be as satiating, something like white bread. Sugars are not going to be as filling as some more non-processed foods, right? They're empty, like I said. Once you remove that fiber, less vitamins and minerals. And also, you guys will see high glycemic versus low glycemic responses where there's going to be an insulin spike in highly processed foods, which can inevitably lead to insulin resistance and then diabetes, which is correlated with obesity. Now, I'm obviously, I do not mean highly processed foods are bad. I don't mean that whatsoever. I kind of wrote that to just, I would ask the class, what are we thinking? What do we think about highly processed foods? There are certain contextual situations where highly processed foods are preferable, right, than non-processed foods, right? So I kind of just took this quote directly from the text where it's one should consider the context or frequency of their consumption. So in certain situations, highly processed foods are preferable. And you guys will see later on, but the simplest example is when I'm working with athletes and they're like in a game, right, where they need some added sugar, or if they're in track and field, I tell my athletes all the time, as soon as they finish one race, if they have another, if they have a third, get sugar right away. I tell them to have Jolly Ranchers, Skittles, obviously some type of sports drink. But I will tell them to absolutely eat those things right away, these processed foods, to help replenish their blood glucose right away, so they can help elevate their performance later on. So this is the truest sense of the applied world. Last night, around 11 o'clock, of course I was sleeping, I got a text from a former athlete of mine. And it says, and I quote, "Yo, so I've been eating really good lately. So I think, LOL." See the rest of this quote because I'm blocking it. And I'm currently eating cheddar Chex Mix right now. How bad is that for me? So I put that in there because I got this text last night, and it was appropriate that we're talking about carbohydrates this morning. If you look at the quote from Dunford and Doyle, it says, the frequency of their consumption. Right? Processed foods aren't terrible for you. You can eat them, right? But the frequency and the total amount is really what matters. So what I said to him, I said, the general rule of thumb is, an 80-20 is a strong rule of thumb where if you're eating 80% of your foods from relatively good sources instead of something processed like cheddar Chex Mix, you're probably pretty good and you don't have to worry about it and definitely don't have to stress about it. He works out 4 times a week. So I think Like, two reasons. One, depending on the athlete and the context of the athletic situation, you might want processed foods. And two, you can have processed foods. It's not the end of the world. You're not going to develop diabetes or anything if you're eating sugar once a week, twice a week in small amounts. So do not stress over things like that. All right, digestion, absorption, and transportation. I felt a couple graphics were probably easier to explain digestion. So we start with the mouth and the esophagus. The mouth and the esophagus are going to produce salivary amylase, which really does the majority of the digestion of starch. We want to break starch down as early as possible because it is a complex carbohydrate that can't be utilized as its current form as a complex carbohydrate. It's got to be broken down. Right? So if you look at the graphic on the right, it's got to be broken down into our disaccharides, which inevitably are broken down into our monosaccharides. Now the graphic on the left shows us where really all of the absorption takes place. Right? So all of these disaccharides and a little bit of starch. Starch is mostly digested in the mouth, right? In the esophagus. But all of these disaccharides are going to be broken down with these enzymes to monosaccharides. We need to get to these simple sugar forms in order to absorb them. So we don't absorb, right, maltose, lactose, and sucrose until they are digested in the small intestine. So for absorption, right, you see the goal is to get to the small intestine, right? Once we get to the small intestine, glucose and fructose are absorbed differently. I put galactose in lowercase mostly because it's not as relevant, but let's talk about glucose and fructose. So within the small intestine, right, glucose has to be transported through the villi, right? The villi, you guys should remember that, through through a protein carrier called sodium glucose cotransporter. Once that SGLT pulls glucose into the villi, right, it can then migrate towards the bottom, right, of the small intestine, and then it's transported to another protein carrier called GLUT2. GLUT2 can then finally carry glucose into the bloodstream, and then it is transported to the liver, right? So you have two transporter carriers, SGLT and GLUT2. GLUT2 is the main one that carries glucose to the blood and then inevitably to the liver. Fructose is a little different, and that fructose does not rely on SGLT. Fructose enters the villi through another protein carrier called GLUT5, right? GLUT5. And then from there on out, it's very similar to glucose, where it enters the blood through GLUT2 and then is carried to the liver. So it's important to note that through training, right, our transport carriers can be upregulated to an extent. This upregulation of GLUT2, GLUT5, SGLT really occurs through training. Now, the most important thing I would say of this slide is that, what do we talk about? We never say our blood fructose levels, right? You ever heard anyone say blood fructose levels? That's because fructose doesn't really exist in our bloodstream for the most part, right? Instead, right, fructose and galactose, just like glucose, are transported to the liver. Galactose, right, galactose and fructose are converted to glucose. And then from the liver, they're sent out to the rest of the body with their transport carriers, right? So we need to convert galactose and fructose to glucose. Now, metabolism, right? So we've got digestion, we've got absorption. Now, metabolism. So metabolism works as a negative feedback loop. You guys should have heard this in your exercise physiology classes, where essentially as something comes up, right, that thermostat. So the thermostat is the classic example of a negative feedback loop, where as temperature rises, the thermostat is triggered, causing a release or an increase of the air conditioned function, or turned on, I should say, and that causes a lowering of the temperature. So similar in the body, we've got this basic levels of resting blood glucose, which is 70 to 100 milligrams per deciliter, right? So anytime we are above or below that range, our negative feedback loop is triggered on, right? So if we get above, so if your blood glucose levels increase, right, above that level, this causes an increase of insulin, right? So there's a cascade effect. As insulin is increased, this causes an increase of GLUT4. GLUT4 is another very, very important transport carrier, right? GLUT4 is going to help transport blood glucose to skeletal muscle. Incredibly, incredibly important that we understand that. It upregulates it by GLUT4 migrating to the surface of the cells within the muscle. When it migrates to the surface of the cells within the muscle, it can better bind with glucose, allowing glucose to enter the muscle cells. Once glucose enters the muscle cells, because of GLUT4, your blood glucose levels start to decrease. Your brain understands this and causes a decrease in insulin release. You guys should know, right? Insulin is released from the beta cells of your pancreas. We should know that, right? Conversely, if our blood glucose levels drop below that 70 milligram mark, right, glucagon actually is increased, okay? And as glucagon is increased, that stimulates the liver to break down glycogen, because the glycogen is stored in both the muscle and the liver, right? As glycogen is broken down to glucose, it is sent out to help raise your blood glucose levels, okay? Hopefully you guys are following me so far. Glycemic index. We have to talk about the glycemic index. It's gotten a lot of attention over the past 20, 30 years. We classify all foods as high, low, or medium on the glycemic index, and they're classified based on how high and how long our blood glucose levels are raised. So anytime you eat anything, right, if I eat this banana, if I eat this protein shake, right, it's going to cause an increase in our blood glucose levels based on what we just saw, digestion, absorption, right? And we've assigned a score to it. So anything above 69 is considered high on the glycemic index. Anything below 56 is considered low on the glycemic index. Very generally speaking, we want to avoid high glycemic index foods, right? So primarily used for diabetes. So the glycemic index was born out of diabetes patients. So yeah, it's helpful to know that. I already said where those highly processed foods that are high in sugars, right? Those are some situations where we might want a high glycemic index food. So a highly processed sugar is also likely to be very high on the glycemic index, right? And if it's high on the glycemic index, athletes may want them in certain situations. This is that perfect example of an athlete that's competing for, 30 minutes, 60 minutes, an hour and a half. Once they're competing for prolonged periods of time, you want that spike in blood glucose. You want that spike in insulin to increase GLUT4 activity, and then get that get the glucose to the muscle, right? Utilization and storage. I didn't spend too much time on this because we talked about glycolysis and phosphorylation, but if energy demands are high and the availability is high, glucose can be utilized right away through glycolysis or the oxidative system. Now, if energy demands are low and availability is high, we start to store glucose as glycogen, okay? So remember, glycogen is the storage form of glucose. We store glycogen primarily in our muscle and a little bit in our liver. Approximately 400 grams is stored in the skeletal muscle of the average person. It's important to note through training, right, we can actually increase the amount of glycogen that we're going to store within our skeletal muscle. Now here's something that's kind of cool for some of you guys who are interested in like body weight and appearance, whether you're talking about bloating or not. So it's about 450, 490 grams, I forget exactly, equates to 1 pound, right? So let's say this 400 grams equates to just shy of a pound, right? But we have to understand that a trained person is going to hold much more. So a trained person, let's say, holds, I don't know, 550 grams, so a little over a pound. Then, right, we also have to remember this. I don't remember if the chapter talks about this, but carbohydrates and glycogen specifically retain water. So the conversion is usually 2 to 3 grams per 1 gram of glycogen. Sorry, somebody texted me. So all of a sudden, if we're holding 500 grams of glycogen in our muscle, plus about 100 grams in our liver, because it's about 90, so we'll say 100. All of a sudden, we've got 600 grams of glycogen. For every 600 grams of glycogen, we're going to hold, let's say 3. That equates to 1,800 grams of water, right? So for every gram of glycogen, we hold 3 grams. If we have 600 grams, we're going to hold 1,800 grams of water. All of a sudden, 1,800 plus 600, we have 2,400 grams, right, that are of extra mass by being fully loaded on carbohydrates. And then finally, 2,400 divided by, I'm going to say 480, that equates to about 5 pounds. And I'm telling you right now, it depends on body size. There's some people that I've seen can hold 900, 1,000 grams of muscle glycogen, right? So start to think about this. If somebody is holding if somebody's fully glycogen loaded, they can hold 5 more pounds of body weight. So depending on what you're looking for, right, you might not want to be fully glycogen. You might not want full stores of glycogen, right? Maybe you want a thinner look. Maybe you don't want to feel bloated. Maybe you're trying to make weight in a competition, which I'll talk about another day, right? Because carbohydrate manipulation is a strong way to manipulate weigh-ins. All right, so that's just a powerful example, and I'm telling you, the 5 pounds is a very low ball number. I know plenty of people that can fluctuate about 10 pounds just on carbohydrate and water depletion. Now, carbohydrate as an energy source for exercise. So the most important thing that we have to remember with regards to carbs as an energy source is that exercise intensity dictates utilization. That's been a topic throughout the semester so far, where we've talked about high intensity exercise using the phosphocreatine system, and then that middle-ish range using the glycolytic system. So our sources, right, of carbohydrate are going to be our muscle glycogen, our blood glucose, and our liver. Right? When I already said our liver converts our glycogen to glucose. While we have these different sources, right, our muscle glycogen is utilized first. So we've got, right now, I've got blood glucose at that resting level. I've got glucose or glycogen coming from the liver, right? But our muscle glycogen is going to be what's utilized first once we start exercising. The book talks about a coin study. I think that's a pretty cool study that you guys should take a look at. I might even link it at some point. Also to note about us utilizing carbs as energy, exercise increases our capacity to metabolize carbohydrates, right? So what does that? Well, through chronic adaptations to training, there's an increase in our mitochondria size and number. More specifically, this usually happens with endurance adaptations. We can also increase our glycogen storage. I already said that, right? The slide prior to this talked about a 20 to 30% increase in muscle glycogen storage just by regularly exercising. So now we're looking at carbohydrate recommendations, right? So the standard recommendation is 3 to 12 grams per kilogram. So I kind of just utilize myself as an example where I'm roughly 80, let's just say it says 80 grams, I'm roughly 80 kilograms, right? So based on this recommendation, I should have somewhere between 240 and 960 grams per day. Or if you convert that to calories, that's about 1,000 to almost 4,000 calories of carbohydrates alone per day. So, well then, I mean, that's a massive range, somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 calories based on my body weight. It's contextually dependent, as you guys should know, right? Depending on what the athlete does. Are they a low intensity sport, right? Something like archery, then these recommendations are on the much lower end. Are they on the high intensity short duration? So like myself, who currently partakes in powerlifting, I'm definitely on the high intensity, very short duration, where my current like one set might only take 5-10 seconds. Right? So I probably want to exist in the 5 to 7 grams per kilogram range. Right? Now the obvious thing is those super endurance sports. Right? So people that train or compete greater than 2, greater than 3 hours. Right? They're going to be on that high end of that spectrum. So I would say for the average person that works out for an hour a day, they're probably in that 5 to 7, maybe 8 grams per kilo. Ultra endurance sports are going to be on that super high end range. If your sport is super low intensity or very short, right, you might want to be on the low end of that range. Now, these recommendations are really based, they don't really talk about it in the book, but it's based on energy maintenance or caloric maintenance. I mean, if I have an athlete who competes in the sport of powerlifting, but they're attempting to gain weight, right, 6 or 7 grams per kilo is simply not going to be enough if they're trying to gain weight. If they're trying to gain weight, they're going to have to exist on the higher end of that spectrum, right? So all these recommendations are based on energy balance, right? Whether you're trying to run an energy deficit or an energy surplus would all affect these. All right, so I think to wrap up here, we talk about when we're ingesting carbohydrates prior, during, and after. Okay, so our goals when we're eating should be to avoid hunger, should be to delay fatigue by providing substrates to our body, minimize GI distress, that's not talked about enough, and then prevent hypohydration. We can alter goals 1 through 3 with carbohydrates. Preventing hypohydration, not really so much. In a sense, we can because carbs retain water, but focusing on 1 through 3 is really what the book talks about. So there's really 2 pre-workout windows. There's a 4-hour period, and then there's anything less than an hour, right? So in the 1 to 4 hour period, you want to eat roughly 1 to 4 grams per kilogram. So once again, using myself as an example, that's going to be roughly 80 grams to 320 grams of carbohydrates, right? 320 grams of carbohydrates is a massive meal, massive, right? So we should intuitively understand that if we're talking about the high end of that spectrum, 4 grams per kilogram, we're probably going to be trying to get that meal in on the longer end of that window block, 3-4 hours out. If you're looking at 80 grams, it's not a small meal, right? 80 grams of carbs is a decent amount. You figure 1 banana is about 25-30 grams. It could be 2 bananas, it could be a banana and a small sandwich, something along those lines. That's probably in the hour and a half to 2 hour range. Now, if you're less than 60 minutes to competition, we want to avoid something called hypoglycemia, right? You guys should know, based on what we've talked about prior, is that as we ingest carbohydrates, the insulin levels spike and our blood glucose levels will drop because of it's transported to the muscle cells. And then if our blood glucose levels drop, we can be in a state of hypoglycemia. Now we want to avoid this because blood glucose levels are helpful when working out. At least our maintenance level is important when we're working out. So what do we want to do? We want to avoid eating high glycemic foods in that 15 to 60-minute window prior to exercise. Okay, so you don't want to eat high sugar foods 30 minutes out, 45 minutes out. If you want to have a small bite of something, that's fine. Remember, the magnitude, the amount of food we're eating is going to affect the insulin response. But you shouldn't be having anything large or even medium. It should be a small snack, if anything. Now, in the less than 15-minute window prior to exercise, anything is pretty much okay. Again, depending on the size, you shouldn't have a massive meal. But high glycemic foods are fine in that less than 15-minute window because the insulin response takes time. So if you're 5-10 minutes out, that blood glucose will not drop in that 5-10 minutes out like it would if you were 40 minutes out, 45 minutes out. Okay, so simple recommendation, don't eat it in that 50 to 60-minute window, especially don't eat anything that's high on the glycemic index. So during exercise, right? So I bolded, not needed for exercise that is less than 45 minutes. And this comes straight from a recommendation from an athlete, and I actually think she watches these slides. So I have people that aren't in this class, and sometimes they watch these videos. But I had an athlete who I worked with. She was a endurance athlete. She was a runner, and she was just obsessed with like her gels and drinking things and whatever. She was just obsessed with eating them. And I tried to reiterate to her that if you're going for a 35-minute run, a 40-minute run, you do not need to gel up. So a gel, if you guys don't know and you're not an endurance athlete, is like a quick packet of about 100 calories of carbohydrates, and you kind of just ingest it. It takes time to it takes away from your speed and takes time to open up the packet and just chug it down. So I kind of just told her, listen, if you're going for 40 minutes, you simply do not need it. It does not affect your performance. Or if you're running a 5K in a race, you do not need it. It does not affect your performance. Most people could finish a 5K in under 45 minutes. She was no different. She would run a 5K in about 24, 25 minutes. But 10 minutes into a race, you don't need a damn goo packet, is what they're called. Now, you do need carbohydrates for exercise or endurance sports. Endurance being something that's longer than an hour. And you also need it for high intensity sports that last more than 45 minutes. So like soccer, a soccer match might last an hour, hour and 15, an hour and 20 minutes. In that case, it is beneficial to ingest carbohydrates during exercise. The standard recommendation is approximately 30 to 60 grams per hour, regardless of body weight. This has been researched, and I don't know if your text talked about it, but our bodies, regardless of our size, cannot change our absorption rates. So a 100-pound female should ingest roughly the same amount of carbohydrates as a 250-pound male, simply because our absorption rates aren't going to be any greater depending on size. Okay. Now, what's kind of cool, and you guys should realize this at this point, is that we can actually increase this absorption rate depending on the foods we eat or the different monosaccharides. So this is because we have varying transporter proteins, which I said much earlier in this presentation. Glucose, right, is going to use that SGLT, right? SGLT, sodium glucose, yes, SGLT, as the transport carrier of your microvilli, right? Fructose uses GLUT5. So if we have a combination of glucose and fructose as our during competition supplement, right, you may be able to actually ingest more than 60 grams, up to 90 grams per hour. This has been researched. It's actually kind of cool, right? There's a lot of talk of having high glycemic index foods. I personally believe, yes, high glycemic index foods are probably going to be more beneficial than low glycemic index foods as far as absorption and utilization rates. So I personally recommend high GI foods during exercise. Just got to be careful with gastrointestinal issues. And then finally, you've got your post-workout, your post-competition window. These are just some standard guidelines. Timing does matter, assuming you have something coming on. So what does that mean? If you work out in the morning and you have a workout in the evening, you 100% want to refuel as soon as possible. If you work out in the evening and then you have a competition or an event the very next morning, which could be 8, 10, 12 hours away, once again, you want to refuel as soon as possible. Now, if your trainings are separated by 48 hours, it doesn't really matter. And it really doesn't matter at all. So if you work out and then your next session isn't, if you work out on Monday and your next session isn't until Wednesday, that nutrient timing doesn't really matter as much. Meal size will help with absorption. So if we're talking about from morning to, I should say meal frequency, not size, but if we're talking about morning to afternoon, right, smaller, more frequent meals are going to be more beneficial than larger meals, and this is because we have a steady insulin response. The type, we're going to prefer glucose and sucrose over fructose. Once again, what's that physiological underpinning? Why would we prefer glucose? Well, glucose is what we actually metabolize within our muscle, right? Fructose, after it gets absorbed from the small intestine, has to be sent to the liver, and then the liver must convert fructose to glucose in the liver. So it's just extra steps in the process. It's not going to refuel you as quick as possible. Right? And then finally, the amounts. Something about 1 gram to 1.2 grams for every hour up to 4 hours seems to refuel people optimally. So the last thing we kind of ended on is just like a standard practice within certain communities, and that's carbohydrate loading. So generally speaking, there's 2 communities that are going to be well served for carbohydrate loading. That's endurance athletes and bodybuilders. I don't know why my hand doesn't pop up here. See, this is weird. But so endurance athletes and bodybuilders. This carbohydrate loading, there's various protocols, but generally speaking, there's going to be some sort of depletion stage. This depletion stage is going to be a combination of very high intensity exercise with extremely low carbohydrate carbohydrate intake. Makes sense. You're exercising at a really high intensity level, you're utilizing all of your muscle glycogen, right? And then if you're not taking much in, you're going to be depleted. This is followed by a repletion stage where there's little to no exercise and you ingest a very significant amount of carbohydrates, about 8 grams per kilo per day. Right? You do that for 3 days. What actually happens is your muscles will supercompensate and actually retain a higher level of muscle glycogen than was previously possible. So endurance athletes would like to do this because if you have more muscle glycogen, right, one of the theories of fatigue is that we just don't have enough substrates available, right? So by being in a supercompensated state, you have more substrates available, you'll be able to exercise for longer, right? Now bodybuilders are different. They would do it for a different reason. They would do this because your muscle glycogen creates a full look within the muscle belly. So if you look at my bicep right here, right, this is where your muscle glycogen would go. This is one area, right, one muscle. And if we supercompensate, right, what did I say? There's going to be more retention of glycogen. There's going to be more stuff in here. This creates in the bodybuilding world what we would call a fuller look. The muscle might actually look bigger because you're storing more glycogen within the muscle. And bodybuilders, of course, would always like a bigger look, right? So that's another population that might actually utilize a carbohydrate loading protocol. Now, important things to note are that the depletion stage may affect your exercise performance. It will. If you're depleted, you're not going to be able to exercise at a high intensity level. And it may also affect your mood. It's very common to be on a very low carbohydrate diet and be moody. Now, when you enter the repletion stage, well, what did I say, right? Glycogen retains water. For every 1 gram of glycogen, 3 grams of water, right? And if you're retaining water, this may increase your body weight. This might make you actually look a little bit more bloated, right? So that really affects both communities, the endurance athletes and the bodybuilders. If I'm 5, 6, 7 pounds heavier because I'm holding both extra glycogen and extra water, that might be counterproductive. As a bodybuilder, if I'm holding more water, I might have a more bloated look, which may affect my performance on stage. And then lastly is GI distress. Having such a high amount of carbohydrates may lead to a GI distress issue. So that is it for today for carbohydrates. I am going to send you guys 1 or 2 papers to review for following week. It is going to be on ketogenic diets. I think that's a pretty cool area to explore with where we currently are in the semester. So be prepared to read those articles.